The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Marcus Steele's penthouse office as he stared at the city lights blurring through the storm. For 37 years, he had built his empire one calculated decision at a time, sacrificing everything, his marriage, his relationships, his soul, for the intoxicating rush of success. Tonight, as he prepared to lay off 300 employees to boost quarterly profits, a hollow ache settled in his chest. When had he become the villain in his own story? Marcus Steele hadn't planned to come home at 3:47 p.m. on that gray October afternoon. The merger negotiations had collapsed earlier than expected, leaving him with an unexpected window of freedom in what was typically a 16-hour workday. As he slid his key into the lock of his Manhattan penthouse, he expected nothing more than blessed silence and perhaps a glass of his vintage scotch. What he found instead would shatter everything he thought he knew about the people who moved invisibly through his world. The soft murmur of voices drifted from his kitchen, a space so pristine and unused it might as well have been a museum exhibit. Marcus paused, his hand still on the doorknob. His housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, wasn't scheduled until Thursday, and his security system showed no unauthorized entries. The voices grew clearer as he approached, and he recognized one of them, Elena Rodriguez, the night janitor from his corporate headquarters. Marcus pressed himself against the hallway wall, bewildered. How had she gotten into his private residence? More importantly, why was she here instead of cleaning his office's 40 floors below? "It's okay, sweetheart," Elena's voice carried the warm cadence he'd heard echoing through empty corridors during his late-night office sessions. "The medicine will help your fever break." Curiosity overrode caution as Marcus peered around the corner. The sight that greeted him defied every assumption he'd made about the quiet woman who had cleaned his building for the past 3 years. His sterile kitchen had been transformed into a makeshift medical station. Elena knelt beside a young boy, no more than 8, who lay on blankets spread across the marble floor. The child's face was flushed with fever, his small chest rising and falling in labored breaths. Nearby, an elderly man sat hunched in one of Marcus's designer chairs, a makeshift bandage wrapped around his weathered hand. But it wasn't just 2 people. As Marcus's eyes adjusted, he counted 6 individuals scattered throughout his kitchen and adjoining breakfast nook: a teenage girl with a crying infant, a middle-aged woman clutching a prescription bottle, and 2 more children huddled together on the floor. "Elena," whispered the woman with the prescription bottle, her voice thick with a Spanish accent, "are you sure this is safe? If someone finds us here..." Elena smoothed the feverish boy's hair with infinite tenderness. "Mr. Steele never comes home before midnight, and the building security knows me. We're safe here, Maria. Little Carlos needs somewhere warm and clean to fight this infection." Marcus felt his breath catch. They were using his home as a refuge, and Elena, his employee, was orchestrating it all. But how had she gained access? As if reading his thoughts, Elena stood and walked to the window, pulling out a key that Marcus recognized with shock. It was his spare, the one he'd given to Mrs. Chen for emergencies. But how had Elena? "Mrs. Chen gave it to me before she passed," Elena said softly to the elderly man, as though sensing the question hanging in the air. "She made me promise to help her friends when they had nowhere else to go. She said Mr. Steele had a good heart buried somewhere deep, and his home should serve a purpose beyond just existing." Marcus's knees nearly buckled. Mrs. Chen had died 4 months ago. He'd sent flowers to the funeral he was too busy to attend. He'd never replaced her, preferring the solitude of his empty penthouse. Elena continued, "She told me about the medical supplies in the master bathroom, how Mr. Steele stockpiled everything after his mother died of cancer. He keeps them like shrines," she said. "But shrines don't heal people." The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. His mother's leftover medications, the first aid supplies he'd obsessively gathered during her illness, the equipment that had sat unused since her death, Elena had been quietly distributing them to people who actually needed them. "Mama Elena," the teenage girl whispered, rocking her crying baby, "the formula you brought yesterday saved Rose's life. The doctors at the free clinic said another day without proper nutrition and..." She couldn't finish the sentence. Elena moved between her makeshift patients like a trained nurse, adjusting blankets, checking temperatures, dispensing medications with careful precision. Marcus watched in stunned silence as she knelt beside each person, offering not just medical care but something far more valuable: dignity, respect, and unwavering compassion. "How long have you been doing this?" the elderly man asked, his weathered fingers clutching Alina's hand. 3 months, Elena replied, cleaning his bandaged wound with supplies Marcus recognized from his own medicine cabinet. "Ever since the city started cracking down on the homeless shelters. People need somewhere safe to heal, somewhere they won't be turned away because they can't pay or don't have the right papers." Marcus realized with growing horror that while he'd been planning mass layoffs to increase his profit margins, Elena had been saving lives with his unwittingly donated resources. Every night, as he worked late in his office, she'd been slipping away from her janitorial duties to transform his cold, empty penthouse into a sanctuary. The feverish boy, Carlos, began to stir, his eyes fluttering open. Elena immediately knelt beside him, placing a cool cloth on his forehead. "Tia Elena," he whispered, using the affectionate term for aunt, "are we still hiding?" Elena's voice broke slightly as she responded, "Just until you feel better, Mia more. Just until you're strong again." Marcus found himself gripping the doorframe as the full magnitude of Elena's secret revealed itself. She wasn't just borrowing his space, she was filling it with the very humanity he'd spent decades avoiding. Every sterile surface now served a purpose, every unused room had become a haven for the invisible people his corporate decisions had likely displaced. "I need to go check on the others upstairs," Elena said, and Marcus's blood ran cold. Others upstairs. How many people had she brought into his home? As Elena disappeared toward the service elevator that led to his guest floors, Marcus remained frozen, wrestling with a tornado of emotions. Anger at the violation of his privacy warred with something deeper, something he couldn't quite name. He should call security. He should have Elena arrested for trespassing, theft, and God knew what else. Instead, he found himself stepping into the kitchen, where 6 pairs of eyes looked up at him with varying degrees of terror. The elderly man struggled to stand. "Sir, we can explain." "Don't," Marcus said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Don't explain anything yet." He looked around his transformed kitchen, seeing it clearly for the first time. The marble countertops that had never served a meal now held medical supplies organized with military precision. The breakfast nook where he'd never eaten had become a recovery area for Elena's patients. Even his designer chairs were fulfilling their intended purpose, providing comfort to people who needed it most. When Elena returned 10 minutes later, her face went ashen at the sight of Marcus standing among her patients. "Mr. Steele," she breathed, her voice steady despite the obvious fear in her eyes. "I can explain everything." Marcus studied the woman who had been invisible to him for 3 years, really seeing her for the first time. Elena Rodriguez wasn't just his night janitor, she was a healer, a protector, a guardian angel operating in the shadows of his indifference. "How many people?" he asked simply. Elena lifted her chin with quiet dignity. 16 tonight, sometimes more, sometimes less. I never take anything that isn't medicine or medical supplies. I always clean everything before I leave. I never. How many people have you saved?" The question hung in the air like a prayer. Elena's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "I don't keep count," she whispered. "I just help who I can." Marcus looked at little Carlos, now sleeping peacefully with normal breathing. He looked at the baby who had stopped crying and was nursing contentedly in her teenage mother's arms. He looked at each person Elena had gathered into his home, people he passed every day without seeing, people whose lives had been touched by a kindness he'd forgotten how to show. "The spare key," he said finally. Elena nodded, pulling it from her pocket. "Mrs. Chen made me promise to help her friends. She said you'd understand, someday." Marcus took the key, and for a moment, Elena flinched as though expecting him to call security. Instead, he walked to his kitchen drawer and pulled out a second spare key, pressing it into her trembling hands. "Mrs. Chen was right," he said softly. "But she was also wrong about one thing. This isn't my home anymore, it's yours. All of yours, for as long as you need it." The silence that followed was broken only by little Carlos's steady breathing and the distant sound of rain against the windows. Marcus looked around at the faces staring at him in disbelief, and for the first time in decades, he felt something he'd almost forgotten: the weight of genuine responsibility, not for profit margins or stock prices, but for human lives. "Elena," he said, his voice growing stronger, "tomorrow I want you to quit your janitorial job. I'm hiring you as the director of the Marcus Steele Foundation for Emergency Medical Care. Your salary will be whatever you need it to be, and your job will be to do exactly what you've been doing, saving lives." Elena's tears finally fell, and Marcus realized his own eyes were wet. "The merger I was negotiating today," he continued, "was going to fund 300 layoffs. Instead, it's going to fund 300 beds in a proper medical facility. A place where people don't have to hide, where healing happens in the light." As Marcus looked around his transformed penthouse, he understood what Mrs. Chen had known all along, that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars accumulated, but in lives touched, in suffering alleviated, in hope restored. Elena Rodriguez hadn't stolen from him, she'd given him back his soul. That night, Marcus didn't return to his office. Instead, he stayed in his kitchen, learning the names and stories of Elena's 16 patients, understanding for the first time what it meant to be truly, immeasurably rich.